My name is John Price. I teach Japanese, Pacific, and Asian Canadian history in the Department of History. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk, the inaugural Michiko Midge Ayukawa Commemorative Lecture. This workshop is taking place on the traditional and unceded territories of the Straits and Coast Salish peoples who have inhabited and cultivated these lands for hundreds of years. Since Chief Makina first met British and other European explorers in Yuquot 230 years ago, First Nations have fought for their land and their rights. Today, those struggles continue and deserve our support. This lecture would not have been possible without the support of the Victoria Nikkei Cultural Society and the Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives. Both Mike Abbey, Chair of the Nikkei Society, and Helen Lansdowne, Associate Director of CAPI, are with us this evening, and I ask that you join me in thanking them. Could you please stand, Mike and Helen? Tonight's session is the inaugural Midge Ayukawa Commemorative Lecture, and I'd like to ask my colleague from Sociology, Dr. Karen Kobayashi, to say a few words about our mutual friend and mentor, Midge Ayukawa.
The Ayukawa Commemorative Fund was established last year by the Department of History at the University of Victoria in honor of the life and the work of Dr. Michiko Midge Ayukawa, who dedicated her later years to the study and telling of Japanese, Canadian, and women's history. Born in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1930, Midge had just turned 12 when she and her family were interned at Lemon Creek in the interior of British Columbia during World War II. And then after the war, the family moved to Hamilton, where she completed high school and attended McMaster University, receiving an honors degree in chemistry in 1952 and a master's degree the following year. Midge married Carl Ayukawa in 1955 and worked at the National Research Council in Ottawa until 1956, when she started a family. After her 5 children were in school, she taught undergraduate chemistry lab classes at Carleton University and later at the University of Victoria after the family moved to Sook in 1980. Following the passing of her husband in 1981, Midge began her second academic career studying Japanese history and language at the University of Victoria. And it was a trip to Japan in 1983 that is credited with precipitating her interest in her ancestral and her roots. And Midge began her studies in Japanese language, literature, and the histories of both Japan and Canada here at the University of Victoria soon thereafter. And she received a BA and an MA and eventually a PhD in 1997. Her dissertation, which was entitled Creating and Recreating Village, Hiroshima and Canada, 1891 to 1941, was adapted for publication in 2008 by UBC Press, and it was later published in Japanese. She published many articles on the history of Japanese immigrants, especially women, and the experiences of the Japanese Canadians during World War II. A number of research fellowships facilitated her work in these areas. Post-PhD, she traveled extensively throughout Asia and Europe and intensified her practice of Taoist Tai Chi, teaching health recovery classes to older adults and people with physical disabilities at the Taoist Tai Chi Center in Victoria. In 2007, she was inducted into the McMaster University Alumni Gallery. She was an active board member of the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center in Burnaby, and in September 2013, she was awarded the Japanese Canadian History Preservation and Education Award at a lavish ceremony at Nikkei Place in Vancouver. Terry Watada wrote in his tribute to Midge in the JCCA Bulletin, Midge was one of a cadre of Nisei intellectuals, including Tom Shoyama, including Tom Shoyama and Dr. Irene Uchida, Henry Shimizu, and others who demonstrated the best qualities of being Japanese Canadian and therefore Canadian. Midge's 5 children, Hannah, Michael, Ken, Patty, and Carla, and her 10 grandchildren, Aki, Patrick, Eric, Irene, Courtney, Emma, Chelsea, Carly, Mika, and Nicholas were her pride and joy. And we are honored this afternoon to have Patty here with us to mark this inaugural event. Patty, did you? Midge Ayukawa was as much a devoted wife, mother, and grandmother as she was an academic, feminist, writer, and dedicated contributor to multiple communities. Her incredible commitment to the preservation of history on both sides of the Pacific and to her family is truly her legacy. I would now like to call upon Dr. John Price again to introduce our inaugural lecturer, Terry Watada.
It's my pleasure to introduce Terry Watada. About 7 or 8 years ago, I read Terry's first novel, Kuroshio, The Blood of Foxes. What struck me reading Kuroshio is how Terry was willing to foreground difficult issues and people of the community. In Kuroshio, Terry gives us 2 protagonists, Yoshiko Miyamoto, a picture bride, married to a ne'er-do-well, an older man who becomes an alcoholic. The second character developed in this work is Etsuji Mori, an oyabu, or local boss, who became a kingpin in the Vancouver community in the 1930s. Terry draws on the conflict between Mori and a younger group of Nisei to highlight the complexity of the community and its relationship to the war in China in the 1930s. I don't want to reduce Terry's work to that of an iconoclast, but there are 2 features of Terry's work that I'd like to bring to your attention. I've produced on the sheet that I handed out the list of select publications. What struck me about that list is not only how prolific Terry has been, but also the scope of his interests and the mediums in which he engages, from manga to poetry to music to plays to novels and short stories. Terry has had an incredible lifetime of varied interests. And Terry has done this all while teaching at Seneca College for over 30 years, writing a weekly column in the Nikkei Voice, and composing and performing music in a variety of genres. The second point I'd like to stress is that Terry's work transcends a single community. From his earliest days, Terry has engaged with writers and artists in other Asian Canadian communities, and just recently he was appointed the senior editor of the Ginger Post, an online Asian Canadian cultural magazine. It is no wonder that the University of Toronto has created the Terry Watada Special Collection as part of its library holdings. Terry has won numerous awards, including, most recently, the Dr. Gordon Hirabayashi Human Rights Award for a lifetime dedicated to the development of human rights in Canada. I can think of no better person to inaugurate the Ayukawa Lecture Series. Please join me in welcoming Terry Watada.
I use this to gain sympathy, by the way. Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you, John. Should I turn on the microphone?
I think we're doing fine. I think we're doing fine.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome. Thank you for coming. I know it's more for Midge than me, so. And I don't mind, because Midge Ayukawa was a sometime mentor to me, certainly a role model, and most importantly, a very good friend who always encouraged me to back me at everything that I would do. And you can't buy that kind of support. I'd also like to thank the people who organized this whole, I guess, week for me. Patty Ayukawa, of course, there you are, wonderful woman. Tsugio Kumishima. Is he here today? Ah, oh, okay. Mike Abe. We had a great dinner the other night down in Chinatown. Karen Kobayashi, who, by the way, went to Japanese language school with my nephew, as I was informed. And I'm sure she has some tales to tell me about him, so I can use it against him. And, of course, the incomparable John Price, precious man. I mean, geez, he's wonderful to me. And I'd like to thank them all. And get into the whole area of storytelling, which is what my inaugural speech is about. And storytelling, perhaps, is the only way that I have of reclaiming the past. I was born in the East End of Toronto, in a working class neighborhood known for its Greek and Italian population. There were some Japanese Canadian neighbors. I mean, the corner store was owned by the Shimanos, and I'd always go there and get some candy and whatever else. And Mrs. Miyamoto, you know, I never knew her first name, but she was just a few houses down, and she was the community caterer. If you wanted platters full of sushi and special Japanese fish, she would be the one to go. And people from all over the city would go to her. Now, I had a little, love-hate for Mrs. Miyamoto because she always burst into the house. We didn't keep the doors locked back then, during the daytime. And she would just, anytime she felt like it, would come over, bang open the door, and scream out loud, "Omasa!" Now, that wasn't so bad. But the only problem is sometimes when I got into my teens, I would be walking around with underwear on, only underwear on. And she would just burst in, "Omasa!" and I'd run for cover. Now, I made the mistake one day of locking the front door, and she nearly impaled herself on it trying to get in. And I got the lecture of my life from my parents. "How dare you? Who do you think you are?" But she does this. Okay, fine. Turns out later, I'm talking about storytelling, I found out that she, had 3 husbands. Each of them died in a terrible way. One vivid one was the second one who went over a waterfall in BC for some reason. And the other thing is that her daughter was known as the Brown Bomber because she had dark skin. And that story is in here, and how she felt the prejudice of the her Nisei friends, and not friends actually. But I won't go into that right now. My parents were very Japanese. My mother couldn't use the word white, oddly enough, when describing white people. She would call them Canadians. Now, the implications of that are enormous, but I didn't think about it then. But they were Canadians, or they were British. And I'd say, "But he's from Sweden." She'd just look at me, And I was Japanese, and there was no other way I could be. Never forget that, she would tell me. "You are Japanese, and nothing else." I assumed my parents came from Japan, lived in Vancouver for a while, maybe Steveston, because when we came here in 1959, we visited their friends in Steveston, before coming to Toronto. Didn't know anything about the internment, didn't know what they did just after the war. I thought they came straight to Toronto. And when I thought about it, how could I not think anything else? Because of all the Japanese elements around the house, there was the weekly delivery of food from Dundas Union. There was a truck that went around to all the Japanese Canadian houses around the city. And they would have a truck van full of supplies, 100-pound bags of rice, which I was charged with carrying into the house and into the basement when I was a teenager. And all kinds of other delicacies that came from Japan. There were calendars, the woman in the kimono and the parasol looking demurely into the out. There were books, there were magazines. We got the New Canadian once a week. My mother was always confused because she'd tell me about an article in the New Canadian and it wasn't anywhere in the English section. It was just in the Japanese section. By that point, the 1950s and 60s, the New Canadian really was just a series of clipped articles from Japanese newspapers or other newspapers and put into it. And so, and also there were all these outrageous claims in the English section, right? Japanese scientist discovers cure for cancer. Okay. We didn't hear about it anywhere else, but it was in the New Canadian. So really, it was irrelevant by that point. They barely covered community activities. Maybe there was a baseball score for the local team, or what else was there now? Curling results, bowling results, etc. But nothing, and an announcement of a dance or two. But anyway, they were always around the house. And so, yes. Then we also observed all the traditions. Oshogatsu, with the shechijori, the food. Obon, we always went to the Hyde Park, it was in the early days, and later on in City Hall, and there was a bon dance down there. JC community picnics that were held around Toronto. And of course, the Japanese language school, as I mentioned, which I hated. I went there to donate my tuition. That was it. I believe my favorite subject was recess. But all the sansei were there. That was the amazing thing. I think that's what I drew from that experience more than anything. I was there 10 years, crying out loud. And I made all these friendships. Oh, the last thing that we had there was the household butsudan. The family altar with all the pictures of the deceased relatives. Okay. And of course, my parents weren't saying otherwise. Nothing about history, nothing about the so-called Canadian community and the traditions. Silence about the past was the mainstay of the household and family. It wasn't really until 1970 when a sansei man, a sociology student at the University of Toronto, by the name of Hotta, brought together a group of Asian Canadians, Japanese and Chinese Canadians mostly, to form a rap group. And I'm not talking about the current music trend. To rap meant in those days was to talk to one another. And you could sit in a circle or whatever. And they were inspired by Professor Ron Tanaka, who was an English professor at UBC. And he was inspired by the Asian American movement in California. So we got together all these sanseis, and they were called CBCs, Chinese, Canadian, and Canadian-born Chinese, that's right. And Alan invited me because I wrote the song New Denver. And the lyrics were printed in the New Canadian. Now, I started writing songs, original songs, in 1970 after I retired from my career as a rock and roll musician. I ever played in was, they played top 40 hits only, nothing original. But the trigger for me was in 1969 at the Hiroshima Day commemoration down at City Hall. Basically, it was a protest against the Vietnam War, as much as it was a commemoration of Hiroshima Day. And so they wanted, the group I was in called the Asia Miners. Sounds like an archaic, silly name, I know, but we were known around the city, and we were all Asian Canadian. And so the organizers thought, well, bring these guys in, Vietnam and all that, South Asia, let's bring them in. So we were scheduled to play. But the thing about the Asia Miners, that was mostly made up of family members. It was like the Beach Boys of the time, The two brothers, a cousin, and a sister formed the nucleus of the band, and I was the lead singer, and my friend Gary Kawasaki played bass. And so I told them that we were going to play at City Hall, basically in protest of the Vietnam War. And they got back to their mother, who is Jean Lum, who is, well, I mean, she was the doyen of Chinatown. She saved Chinatown, in fact, and she did a lot for immigration into Toronto. And when she heard this, that her children were going to play for a North Vietnamese cause, so she interpreted, she said, it can't be done. So she actually tried to break up the festival, which was the entire City Hall front area. And so she called in favors of the mayor and several council people and all kinds of other police department stuff. But the organizers were well organized, and they had rock solid, contracts, and she couldn't stop it. So she did the next best thing. She forbid her children from appearing, and they were all in their 20s. Some were, late 20s, in fact, about to start their careers. But such was her influence that they said, we can't play Terry. And it broke my heart, because I thought I was finally doing something in protest, something positive. So I said, okay, well, the hell with that, I'll go by myself. And I didn't realize what an experience that would be, because here are all these thousands of people in front of me. I'm on the stage by myself with my guitar, and so I played a song. Not an original song, but it was called I Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die, Rag, by Country Joe McDonald and the Fish. I won't sing it for you now. But it gave me something, It was like, wow. I felt the power of being there, talking to these people. And they were all listening and singing along and clapping. And I thought, wow, this is the way to go. Soon the band broke up. And I started writing songs for myself. The first rule, of course, of songwriting is write what you know. And I decided, what did I know? I didn't even know how my parents met. So, all innocent and whatever else, I went to my mother and asked, so Mom, how did you meet Dad? And she looked in horror at me and said, Makatare again. Her favorite word of me, I think, My father had a worse word. Maybe I'll say it later. But she just shut down and said, you don't need to know that stuff. Oh, okay. So I waited till my dad had a little Canadian Club whiskey, and so he started telling me about coming to Canada, and especially with Mom. He decided to get married at 27, 26, was fairly late. And so he wrote home and said, hey, find me a wife. And so they did. From a fishing village on the Sea of Japan side, Fukuiken. And so my father, instead of waiting for his bride, actually went to Japan, see his family again, and then got married. Interestingly enough, he was there 2 weeks when the Japanese government said, we're going to conscript you into the Japanese army and you're going to Manchuria. And my father said, the hell I am. I'm going back to Canada. And then the Canadian government said, you can't bring your wife. 2 years you have to wait before she can come in. I don't know, some bizarre sort of law that they came up with. So he left because he didn't want to be conscripted and fight in a war that he had no business of being in. And his wife, my mother, stayed in Japan. She was 16 at the time, and so very happy to stay. In fact, she called him a gaijin. That is gaijin. I don't want to go with him. I'd rather stay here with my family. So 2 years she waited. So finally she got on a boat and left for Victoria, I guess. Yeah, Victoria. And of course, when she got here, who was waiting for her but a stranger? Allegedly a cousin, who said, I will take you to your husband. And it was up the coast of Vancouver Island till, I think it might have been Alert Bay. where he was working on a logging raft. And she joined him there. And she told me, finally, she started opening up, she said the only place that they had for couples was a chicken shack. And so she cleaned out that chicken shack, scrubbed it for days, and never ate chicken after that. And so that was her beginning. And when I heard this, of course, I thought she was extremely lucky because at that time, women were being kidnapped right off the dock by strange men who said they represented, their husbands. I got this from Midge, actually. And so she told me that my mother was extremely lucky that he was telling the truth. So, with this story and others that followed, I realized there was a huge hole in my family's history. In fact, Japanese-Canadian history, my community. And so I was determined to reclaim my past. So eventually, I learned about the internment from my parents. And so I wrote the song, New Denver. Here are some of the lyrics. Internment camps in BC's wilderness are all I recall. And I'm too old to think about the past with bitterness in my heart. I fell in love with you in the camp so long ago. It kept us from the hatred and the bigotry that existed outside. New Denver is washed away with the rain. New Denver will never know the pain. I debuted the song in the 1972 Asian Canadian Conference in Toronto. And I was part of the organizing committee to put that on. In fact, I organized the Arts Nights at the University of Toronto, where we showcased Japanese and Chinese Canadian musicians and poets and other writers. And when I played that song, I discovered that I had an audience, which I really didn't think I had before. And it was, again, another life-changing moment for me. So I knew that I could continue to write more and more songs about the same subjects. Also at the, I think it was Mutual Street House where the conference was being held, was a display of the internment camp photographs that the Vancouver people had dug out of the archive. Now this is the first time that anyone had seen these photographs, and they were on display on the walls. And it's stark black and white, and again, it moved me. I never knew, right, how intense the experience was. And in fact, all who saw it were very moved by the photo exhibit. And it did answer some of my questions about my family's past. It further triggered a desire to explore more. I wanted really to know about my community pre-war and otherwise. I wanted to know why certain things existed in Toronto's JC community. For example, I'm sure no one knows here that there was a J-town, a Japantown in Toronto in the 1950s and 60s. There's no remnants of it anymore. But it was there. It was there where all the Japanese Canadians lived. Well, most of them anyway. So I started with my parents, and I asked, I got my dad liquored up. And he told more stories about the time he came to Canada. My grandfather came to Canada first in order to make money and then take it back to Japan and allow his family to survive, because the economy then was terrible. And there was no money. I mean, he was a rice farmer, but there was no money to be made. So he would come to Canada, he'd make a lot more money in Canada, took on various jobs, the railroad, mining, lumber camp, fishing, whatever he could. And eventually, he brought his eldest son and his second son, my father, who was at that time 14 years old. And my father recalled those days fondly. They roomed in the Powell Street area, and he was an adventurous kind of guy. I mean, he thought himself on a big adventure. So he went over to Gastown, I believe, and he went into a restaurant there. You know, and there's nothing but white people in there. Sorry, Canadians. And he sat down, and I envisioned the scene where a big burly man on the counter said, "So what would it be, Mac?" And my father, of course, didn't know any English, and a menu was thrown in front of him, swimming with English words, didn't know, so he just went like this. Fortunately, it was eggs and sausage. He got that plate, it was ambrosia. It was never had tasted eggs and sausage before. This was amazing, he said. So, for the next 2 weeks, breakfast, lunch, dinner, eggs and sausage. He never ate eggs and sausage again. But then, one day, his father came to him and said, "Matsujiro, I'm going home." You know, and he said, "Okay, Dad, when are we going?" "No, I'm going home. I'm taking your brother, but you're staying here. There's nothing for you in Japan. All the property will go to your brother. You can't get a job there. What are you going to do? Here, you have a job, you have a place to stay, so long." And as the story goes, my father, I think, had just turned 15 at the time, and he was let alone to make his own way in this country. Now, naturally, he became extremely homesick. And one day, as a 15-year-old would do, he wrote a letter home, rolled it up, put it in a bottle, threw it in the ocean. Believe it or not, that bottle floated all the way up the coast, right around the Alaskan coast, out to the Aleutian Islands, where a native Aleut found it, fished it out of the water, pulled out this message. Couldn't read it because it was all in Japanese. So he took it to the U.S. Naval installation there. And believe it or not, they thought it was a spy note. Oh. I mean, come on. There must be easier ways to get a message out. But the captain said, "Oh, you don't know about these guys." Japan at that time, this is 1920 or so, was a world power, a military power. So there was a fear, even though they were allies. So he actually sent it to Washington, D.C. for translation. They translated it, and this is what they got. It's in this book too. Let's see what it says here. April 15th, 1920. Hello to the household. Is everybody in the Watada family the same? Working as usual? I am safely crossing the ocean without running into any major storms. I am safe. Don't worry. Since I left, the waves were big for 2 or 3 days. All the women were seasick, but I was fine and had a good time. I've made a lot of friends. I'm having a good time on the boat. My mother, my older brother, my older sister, and so on. Not a day goes by that I fail to think of them. Tell them not to worry about me. These days I'm sure that you must be very busy and tired. In every direction I see nothing but sea. But when I look at the sky, I see nothing but clouds. At this busiest time for farmers, I'm just spending money, eating, sleeping, and playing, so it feels wasteful. I feel guilty, in other words. And then the next line is distorted. I would like to write more, but I'm finished here. It will get hotter and hotter, so please, everyone, take care. And from the ship, Watada, obviously it was out of sync. He was in Vancouver when he wrote it, but he was remembering the trip to across the ocean. What's interesting is the relatives in Japan, the DC officials, the naval people, sent it on to Japan with an explanatory letter. And it was delivered. And my father retrieved the letter when he went back to get married. And they gave it to him. And it's been in our family archives ever since. It's a really precious piece of the past for me. Imagine that, though. They always thought it was a spy note. Anyway, for me, then, the act of writing became a way to share those stories. In 1984, my mother died. And as a way of working through my grief, I wrote down as many of the stories I learned about her and the family in a long poem. And that's how this book came about, the 1,000 Homes, which is a literal translation of her name, Chisato. Just a quick read here of one section of it, of her poem. It's called Chisato. In the cemetery mist, 4 sisters were dressed in black. We cried softly about our reunion. Obon, the festival of the dead. I remember the humid laughter of my Japanese sisters. This is about the time in 1959 when they reunited in Japan, and 4 sisters were still alive. The 5th one had died drowning earlier. So it was published by Mercury Press and gained a lot of recognition for it. So I was quite inspired to do more. And then, of course, I became involved in the redress movement. And the best way I worked out that the best way to get the cause of redressism across was to humanize Japanese Canadians in the whole situation. It wasn't just a matter of documents, and for me anyway, documents about the internment, etc., etc. So I wrote more songs, went to schools, went on TV, went on radio, did musical performances across Canada and the United States, colleges, churches, and also did theater, produced theater about the whole internment. And the remarkable thing about the United States is that Japanese Americans had no idea that Japanese Canadians were interned. And so they actually did some research on it. Hey, you guys had a lot worse than we did. So, well, okay, all right, yes, well, okay, we did. Anyway, now the backlash was quite interesting. The president of the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, anybody related to City Kevin? Well, he saw me walk into the Cultural Center auditorium, and I've never seen him move so fast. He literally jumped off the stage, ran right across the room, and got in my face and started swearing at me or talking about the internment and asking for redress. And the big point was that I wasn't there. How dare I bring this issue up? And he was hopping mad. Wow. Never experienced, I mean, this man could have been my father, really. And he is a father figure in the JC community in Toronto. And so it was rather upsetting. And the other person who approached me, is anybody related to Art Irizawa? Okay, good. His claim to fame was that he played Fuji on the Super Dave Osmond Show, which was a popular comedy show in the 1980s? Yeah, it must have been the 80s. He called me up and invited me to dinner, in which he sat down and sincerely asked me to stop talking about redress, stop being on TV and radio. And I looked at him and I thought, what an absurd situation. Here's this guy, puts on a fake Japanese accent and calls himself Fuji on TV and is asking me not to talk about real things? Well, anyway, again, he was very angry with me. But I put it all behind. There were lots of other threatening phone calls and letters and et cetera, et cetera. But the great thing, well, anyway, I'll get to the results of that in the end. Later, I went to the very first internment camp tour organized by the NAJC here on the West Coast. And dozens of Issei and Nisei went along on the tour, and the stories that came out were just amazing. Midge was at Lemon Creek. I don't think very many people know this, but a 17-year-old boy in that camp one day decided to walk out of camp and was never seen again. It is assumed he died of exposure in the woods. And even though search parties went looking for him, they never found any trace of him. And these are the kinds of stories that come out. There's another great story. Everybody know Robert Ito, the actor. He was in this show Quincy. His famous line is, you better take a look at this, Sam, Jack Klugman. He was in Tashmeg, and for some reason he managed to smuggle a camera into camp. And he would take pictures. And of course the Mounties probably thought he was a spy. Grabbed him and said it's against the law to have a camera. So they wanted to arrest him and throw him in jail, even though he was in a camp, internment camp. Well, that's the absurdity of it all. So a man named Roy Shin, who became quite a leader in the JC community in Toronto at the Cultural Center, stepped forward and said, that's my camera. If you're going to arrest anybody, arrest me. So they did arrest him, but I don't think they ever jailed him. Well, maybe they realized this is stupid. So that's one of the stories that came out. All these kinds of things, which was great for me. And so I decided to write a collection of short stories, and that's how Dodoma Days came about. And I coupled it with family stories that I heard, and I put them in the context of ghost stories, because ghost stories, well, are not only intriguing, but it seemed to be big in my life. So I'll just read a little excerpt from this. Let's see. The scream slashed up the mountainsides. A small muscular man burst out through the door of a slouching cabin at the lower end of the valley town. His broad mouth gasped and spat out fragments of words. His shirt ran with sweat. Two of his fellow carpenters grabbed and held him as his face twitched and his eyes grew wild. Goro, what's wrong with you? Shouted Morimoto. Goro shook his head in response. His close-set eyes snapped shut in an attempt to erase whatever horror he had just witnessed. His nostrils snorted with his continued effort to free himself. What's the matter with you? Morimoto repeated. Goro sucked in more air before blurting out, "Oh, bakemono! Ghosts! Ghosts!" The crew stepped nervously back. An audible moan swelled amongst them. The BC Security Commission had appointed Isamu Morimoto to head a group of 7 men to go to the ruined and abandoned town to refurbish the decaying shacks and buildings proposed as a wartime measure to house 1,000 Japanese. The rugged, tall, Boshin with keen eyes and full mustache hired men he knew from the logging camps. Each and every man, understandably, had hesitated. There was much talk about Sandon. The obscure settlement lost in the mountains of the interior was rumored to be haunted by the ghosts of the savage white men and fallen women of the pioneer era. Morimoto slapped Goro's agonized face. Stop it, get a hold of yourself. The boss's usual smooth face with its distinct jawline, flat nose, and slitted eyes was creased with impatience and concern. I think you're just trying to get out of cleaning that cabin. Goro slumped to the wet floor, the air still wheezing through his worn, brownish teeth. Boshin, cried at Shintani from the captain's interest. I think you better see this. The 4-room cabin was larger than most, but had seen better days. Inside were the usual furnishings of a settler's home. Leg-amputated tables, crippled chairs, and cabinets, all dust-laden and spider-web from disuse. Nothing extraordinary. What's so frightening here? Look in the other room. Morimoto ducked his head through the low doorway to the adjacent room. He gasped. In the middle of the floor, a mirror, a full-length Japanese kagami, stood draped in cobwebs, its wooden frame slightly cracked. The convex mirror rested on an ornate lacquered vanity decorated with gold maple leaves. And this was a true story. Frank Moritsugu told me about it, that they actually did find a Japanese mirror sitting in this old miner's cabin up in the at Sandon. So, intriguing, fascinating. I had to know more, right? And I decided that maybe the past is one large ghost story, and so started seeing the connections between the ghost story and the Japanese-Canadian experience. After redress, I began writing plays. I seized on the idea of putting on stage contemporary issues. For example, my play Tale of a Mask is based on the true story of a Japanese immigrant woman in Vancouver who was basically shuttered in. She didn't see anybody, didn't go out, even didn't interact with her family. Her husband wanted to become a karaoke king, believe it or not, and so was never home. And she eventually killed her 2 children, killed him, the husband, and then hanged herself. This was in the 1980s, I believe, in Vancouver. And this was a hidden issue because, as it turned out, many immigrant groups, the women become isolated and they slowly go crazy, as it were. So I wrote that and they staged it in Toronto. I also began hearing a tale about a murder in pre-war Vancouver in J-Town. I don't know why people tell me these things, but you know. And there was Mrs. Kagawa and Mrs. Kobayakawa. Mrs. Kagawa was in Toronto, Mrs. Kobayakawa was in Vancouver. And they both said the same thing to me. Oh, we know who did it and why. And it turned out it was this Issei woman, pioneer woman, who married an abusive man, as John was talking about, my novel Kuroshio. And she eventually killed her daughter and killed her husband, all for the love of this gigolo. And it struck me as impossible. You say women, like my mother, didn't do this kind of thing. My God, they got married and that was it, you know. But apparently it did happen, so I decided to write a novel based on this. And the editors at the Nikkei Voice showed me this photograph of a news story about the coroner, the Vancouver coroner, and 2 police detectives standing in front of one of those old furnaces with just the hole in the wall where the furnace is. And they said it was the remains of the daughter were in that furnace. And oddly enough, the headline was, coroner decides that it wasn't suicide. Apparently the police detectives, when they uncovered this whole thing, decided that this poor daughter killed herself by climbing into a furnace and turning it on. Yes, so I went to the archives looking for more stories related to this and I couldn't find a thing. Very curious. And I went back to my sources and they said, no one was ever arrested, though we know who did it. So I started wondering why. How do you make a novel out of this? And I thought back to my father's old friends. And one of them was a man named Rick-san, Rikimatsu Kintaro. Came over to the house all the time. Scary guy. He had a face like a skull, a head like a skull, right? Hardly any hair, and his nose was cut off. And he had a really graspy voice, you know? And he always gave me $5, so I didn't mind him. What's the word? Anyway, he said he offered me $5 every time, and I took it, much to my mother's dismay. I later found out that quite a colorful guy. He was a jewel smuggler. He was a gambler extraordinaire. And he became a member of the Black Dragon Society, which was the Yakuza gang in North America. And there are other stories of him too, that he was supposed to get married in Japan. And his betrothed ran away, left him at the altar, because, according to my father, he was too ugly to marry. And she just said, that's it, I'm not going to marry this man, and ran away. Imagine how he felt. So he did become a merchant marine and started smuggling jewels and whatever else. One story, as all these stories are, you never know what's true, was that he saw Vancouver, jumped ship, and decided to stay in Vancouver. The other one was he went down to San Francisco and joined the Black Dragon Society down there. Anyway, he met Mori probably in San Francisco, and they came up to Vancouver to take over the gangs here, to get their operations in order. Now, I think I promised Mike I would tell how Rickson lost his nose. They had a conference in LA, a Yakuza conference, believe it or not, in 1930-something or other, when all the leaders of the gangs up and down the coast got together. And there was a problem. They were losing, in effect, $100,000 a year to the Chinatowns. Why? Because the Issei and Nisei, older Nisei, would go down to Chinatown and gamble down there and leave their money there and not at their clubs. So they said, how are we going to rectify this? And so Etsuji Mori came up with the idea. We'll send guys into these gambling dens, right? Tom-operated gambling dens, look for the Japanese guys and convince them that they're being cheated. They probably were, but they were also cheated in the Japanese clubs too. And anyway, he would, these men would just convince them to leave and come back to the Japantown area. And it worked very well until Vancouver. And Rick's son was charged with going down to Chinatown into these places. And so he went in there. And I tell you, this guy could pass for being Chinese or Korean or whatever. He could speak a little bit of each language. And he went down there, and well, the bosses caught on to him, and they grabbed him. And they dragged him into the nearby alley, beat him up, put him to the ground, and the boss came out and without saying anything, just cut his nose off. And they dragged him to another part, well, back to J-Town and left him. I think it was by the San Franciscan Sisters, a building down there, and that's where they found him. So, that's how he lost his nose. Anyway, so this intrigued me, and all the gang stories and whatever else, how Mori exploited the JC community, and also how he helped the JC community. Right? He would take over a restaurant. Why? He didn't want to run a restaurant. He gave it to the Buddhist church because they needed storage space. I don't know. The poor owners of the restaurant, though, they were left out of it. And they did all kinds of other things. And I saw this as a way to dispel Japanese-Canadian stereotypes. That, you know, we were all very passive, and we're law-abiding, and we just were so compliant in everything. But these men clearly were not. And then it came back to the family, when one day I heard that my grandpa had died. Not my real grandfather. He was my father's boss in BC, in the logging camps. But everybody moved to Toronto by that point. And I heard them talking, my mother and father, and they said, Grandpa was asking for forgiveness on his deathbed of his wife. Forgive me for what I did, and pleaded with her. And then afterwards, I had to ask my parents again. Well, you know what my mother said. But I asked them, why was he pleading for forgiveness? And so my father sat me down and said, well, back in the old days, he had, one day the timekeeper for the lumber company came to my father, who was the foreman, and said, we're missing $100,000 in the bank accounts. $100,000 in the 1930s was like $1 million today, maybe more. And it was suddenly gone. And they said, what could have happened to this money? So they went and traced it right back to the boss, the company owner, and apparently they had taken this money and spent it on women. 10 mistresses at the same time. He was a lot stronger than I thought he was. Unbelievable. Are you kidding me? Apparently Mori set this up. He would bring prostitutes in from the United States or from Japan, and they would work for him in these clubs that he had. The Showa Club was one of them, very famous. Raku Raku Club, the Nippon Club. And what it was that he would not spend the money to bring them over. But he would get these sponsors, like the rich men, say, well, you pay for their passage here, their room and board here, and they will come at your bidding. And so this is how my grandfather collected 10, as my father said, wives. My grandfather didn't get away with it too much because sometimes he'd come home in the afternoon drunk as a skunk. And of course that caused a lot of embarrassment. Apparently you could do this, but as long as you weren't, demonstrating this to the neighbors. And my grandmother would grab him by the top of the hair, drag him out into the middle of the street. This is Main Street in Vancouver. Throw him to the ground, start kicking him, swearing at him, spitting at him for being such a ne'er-do-well. And of course he never fought back. So that's why he was begging forgiveness at the end. I don't know if she did. Forgive him, I mean. So, anyway, so I linked his story, the endeavors of the Black Dragon Society, and this woman who killed her family. So, it came not a bad novel, as I humbly offer. I decided to continue with the novel because it's the best form I found that I could actually lengthen out stories, put more details in, put in themes, character development of more than one or two. It's not as constrained as poetry, plays, and short stories. And so for my second novel, I have in draft form, it's called The Three Pleasures. And apparently they existed. These three men in the Japantown area in Vancouver. One was Etsuji Mori, and the other two, all three have the name Etsu in their first names. And Etsu means pleasure. So, and they control different kinds of pleasure. And so I'm going to read an excerpt from it. This is the section on the, I guess they're called the Gambari group, Gambaria group. Although I found a new name for them. They call themselves the Seki Nuki group. I'm not pronouncing that well. But roughly translated, it means renunciation of Canadian citizenship. These men wanted to give up their citizenships and become Japanese. The government wouldn't let them because they're British subjects, and so they couldn't, but this is what they wanted to do. So they staged a protest. And not many of these histories talk about stuff like this, but this was a protest at the Immigration Building, which is at the top of Burrard Street, I believe, no longer there. And they gave themselves up because they wanted to fight the Canadian government, do everything they could to upset the war effort. And so these men went down, there's a fair number of them, and they got themselves arrested. The army, the guys who were guarding the Immigration Building, told them to get lost. Go home. What do you want to get arrested for? I don't need the headache. And so they finally, but they stayed. They just sat down in front of the whole building, built campfires, had food, whatever. And finally, the military said, okay, get in here, you're under arrest. And of course, they were subject to all these various rules, even though they tried to fight against them. And so this is an excerpt from the novel, The Three Pleasures. Not that funny. The next day, with the sunlight beating against the dirty windows, the men stood the required 2 feet away. 2 privates were on guard near the locked exit leading to a down staircase. The room was strangely silent. The authorities had made no effort to improve the conditions since the Yamato boys were taken into custody. But bare cots with a small, inadequate number of blankets dotted the area. Someone, maybe Hammerhead, a great Nisei name, had tied a piece of white cloth to a detached broom handle. It stood as a flag in a corner. Maybe he was expecting an uprising or something. In any case, the inmates lined up in a row as ordered and stared at the closed windows. Slowly, one and then another began complaining about the absurdity of the situation. My old Tosan is out there. He has a right to know I'm all right. How could they let my 65-year-old mother rattle around the house alone and going nuts with worry? One of the guards yelled for everyone to shut up, and it was a useless command. Both stood frozen in place, unwilling to do anything, perhaps afraid to do anything. Angry voices continued to rise in the mausoleum-like room, louder and louder, until someone seized the moment and lunged for one of the windows, opening it in a rush of fresh air. Catching the spirit of defiance, Hammerhead himself grabbed at a window and struggled to open it. Frustrated it remained open, he grabbed a convenient chair and a sweep of arms smashed the glass open to the blue and salt air outside. The signal had been given. The immigration building riot had begun. The two guards immediately escaped through the door, managing to slam and lock it, and then retreated down the stairs, their rifles dragged like a dog's tail between its legs. The prisoners battered their bodies against the exit until it gave and crashed open. Many grabbed fire hoses, unwound them, and turned them on. Water gushed into the outside staircase as wild and thundering ki-ai and shouts filled the building. Dick, caught up in the moment, led the others in hurling benches, beds, and tables, smashing them against the walls and windows. All the frustration, anger over his dad, and shame he and his family suffered must have finally detonated, scattering the debris, unmindful of damage or injury. His flushed face burned with rebellion. The rest of the men, fueled by adrenaline alone, grabbed bars and pried them free, the plaster crumbling with the force. Tosh quickly grabbed the flag and joined Etsu, who led a group through the smashed-in door after the water had been turned off. Just as he made the top of the stairs, gunshots rang out from below. Etsu and the teenager fell back as everyone retreated into the holding room. Tosh grabbed at the leader when he realized his shirt was splattered with jagged red blotches. He looked at his leader's face and found that he was not hurt. He had been shot. He had not been shot. Just as he was about to ask who had been, someone picked up the fallen flag and led a second wave, diving through the door to the stairs. More bullets rang out and ricocheted off walls and ceiling, hitting no one. And again, the men retreated. Gas plumes finally suddenly appeared with a sick fizzing of canisters. Tear gas. Everyone huddled inside the room, and Etsu called for soaking wet bed sheets to be held up to stop the spread of the gas. But then more containers came through the broken windows, and bombs exploded inside the prisoners' area. Cries, screams, and coughing followed it. Men doubled over quickly as the fumes overcame the unprotected. Poison, Tosh called out. It's poison gas. And so that's from the Three Pleasures. I continue today to write. Well, I continue today to write and with the new poetry collection, The Game of 100 Ghosts. And we all have experienced loss in our lives. And so I, in particular, had many friends, close family friends, passed away within the last 5 years. An alarming number, I found. And so in order, as I did with my mother, to work through the grieving process, I wrote poetry. And in developing a course at my college, I came across this game of 100 Ghosts, which was played by the Japanese in the Edo period, 1603 to 1868. And fascinating game. They would gather, I don't know how many people, in a dark room, and they would light 100 candles. And then each person in turn would tell a ghost story. And once that ghost story was told, then they extinguished one candle. And they kept going until all 100 were extinguished. And supposedly in that moment when the smoke was rising and there was no light, a ghost would appear. A visitation. And this is what they hope for anyway. And so I took that idea and put it into this book as the motif for it to propel poetry. And found a few other things too. By all rights, I should give each of you a piece of mochi or pounded rice cake, because when they showed films or told ghost stories, if you ate mochi, then you'd be saved from the ghosts that were coming. Because rice, of course, is the staff of life. But I don't have any mochi, so you're on your own, folks. Anyway, I thought I'd read a couple of poems here, just to give you an idea. A game of ghosts. Night crept like smoke in a forest fire at sundown. The evening settled, and everyone sat in a circle around a circle of candles. In the brilliant splintering demise of the sun, the timid whacked flames before the storytellers flickered and sputtered, feasting on air, awaiting the smoke-filled, capsule-filled bodies of ghosts. Tell the first story. Tell the second. Tell the 100th. Distinguish each candle with each story until the remnant of the past returns and a last conversation, precious and true, takes place. Between the mouths of the grieving and sorrowful and the thoughts of the beloved dead, secrets are revealed. I think that we all crave or desire to have one more day with that loved one. If not a day, then an hour with that loved one. And of course it's frustrating, but it's a universal. And so I wrote this poem and dedicated it to my brother who passed away in 2012, and to Roy Kyoka, who was a great Canadian poet and painter. And they both, well, Roy Kyoka wrote a fabulous, beautiful poem called Kyoto Airs, and it's all about his visit to Kyoto. My brother in the hospice during the last days told me his biggest regret was not going to Kyoto. Always wanted to go there. And of course, his son, my nephew, yelled at him. Why didn't you go? You had the money. So anyway, I dedicate this poem to both of those men. And to the temple, the Kiyomizu-dera, which is a huge, huge temple on the side of a mountain in Kyoto. And if you see it from a distance, you can't believe it's there. It's so supernatural. And the legend is that if you go on the huge balcony in front and jump off, right? If you survive, your wish will come true. So friends of mine said, what would you wish for, Terry? To live, yeah. Exactly. So this is a poem dedicated to them. Falling, tumbling, stumbling through Kyoto airs from the balconies of Kiyomizu-dera. What is your wish? Longer life. To see my grandson become a doctor. To dance and stumble at his wedding. To hear his arguments bubble up and burst their logic all over me. To be treated by my granddaughter's clinic. To kiss her cheek, turn red, and then pink at her wedding. To hear her boast of her successes while feeling my failures. But I will not survive. The fall of wishes and regrets. Kyoto airs bejeweled with light and stars. Too jagged, too foreign, too thin to hold me up. Yet the resin trees breathe deep as I descend into the depths. Perhaps to come out into the light again. Just a break for a commercial here, the books are available over there. And I have told John and others that I will donate $5 from each book to the Midge Ayukawa Fund to continue it. Okay, back to the real thing here. With these poems, with my brother's passing and all the others, the friends, I did have a sense of a disappearing community. And so I do want to continue writing so I can hold them a little longer. But one thing has always bothered me. I've always wondered if I had the privilege of speaking to my community, if anyone was listening. The reaction to Kuroshio was puzzling. In Toronto, the Nisei and Sansei embraced it and bought many copies. In Vancouver, I was totally ostracized. I think the Tabata parents are here, right? Where are they? Yes. Oh, what? Your daughter, while she was doing the Ohanashi project at the Nikkei Museum, had read this book and asked what the Nisei thought of it. And to the one, they said that dumbhead Watada. I could have thought of better word names. Dumbhead Watada wrote or aired our dirty laundry in public. Right? And she had to ask, so you read the book? No, why would I read that book? But the reaction was there. And I found it very curious, the two responses to the book. And to this day, I can't figure it out. But I keep writing. I wrote 25 years worth of columns for the Nikkei Voice, and now I'm into my third or fourth year with the Vancouver Bulletin, writing about, well, themes of the community and whatever else. And that's good, because people read those, and they do come back and say positive things to me. And I think there's so much more to write about. I mentioned Toronto's J-Town. I want to write about that, because nobody has. In fact, very few people knew it even existed. And I also have the gifts of my brother's story. He wrote an autobiography. And my dad's diary of 1942. It's the only diary that he wrote. Sorry, that he kept. Unfortunately, it's all in Japanese, so I'll have to have it translated. But I will continue to write because it's my passion. And I do want to keep my community. To end, I'd like to, because this is Midge's day, Midge's inaugural, I guess, I want to read Midge's House, which was from my first collection of poems. And it came from, it was inspired by a weekend at Midge's house where she graciously let me and my wife stay in Souk, BC. And one night we went outside and she pointed up and said, "That's Cassiopeia." Good grief. And I did a little research on it, and so it inspired me to write this poem about her and her family. Midge's house. Cassiopeia bends her stars and melts light on the roof of the house in the middle of Victoria's woods. Midge lives alone in her retirement in the antiquity of a university degree. Her walls are full of memory. 5 children, the wild one, the pretty one, the one in Japan, are captured in childhood photographs, flowing with rebellious paisley hair. Her husband, Carl Kaoru, died not so long ago. He had movie star looks, a smile full of blessings. He comforts her still. When rage pressed down its clammy palms upon her eyes, I can't. She squeezed herself as if in pain. His voice blew through her gently. Let Toto do it. And the walls lifted. The house beneath the curve of stars holds its breath during her study of long-dead women. In fitful dreams, she comes to know them. Pictured brides blink out into night. The Cassiopeia Nova of 1572, a corner star disappeared. She has time now to coax the voices of dead brides who came to Canada to reveal their secrets. The one who married an insane man. The one who discovered her fiancé to be an old man. The one who endured 50 years of marriage to a man she hated. The constellation bends a corner to listen to the voices emanating from the house where Midge sleeps, dreaming of Cassiopeia, whose eye went blind in the burnout of a fallen star. I want to thank you all, and I want to thank Midge Ayukawa, because she was a blessing to us all. Thank you.